whether it's in a business, in our life, in society, the outer experience we're having is a manifestation of the inner life. So what you're manifesting in your life is a manifestation of your inner life. Integration to me, maybe at the most basic level, is where there is alignment between who I am, my truest nature, how I live, and how I think. They're not in conflict with each other. Because what's the opposite of integration is disintegration. My father and mother split up when I was only 6 months old, and my father lived 2 hours away from me. I started judging my father. What a bad person he must have been, to have lived 2 hours away and not seen his son. But then as I got older and wiser, I realized, no, he just wasn't intentional. Well, one of the things I encourage people to do in their own life is sometimes you look at your life and it looks like a scatter plot. There are all these different things that you've done. But if you really look at it, reflect on it deeply, you'll see the signal through the noise, the line that is there. And I just want to say thank you, Dad, for bringing me into this world. And I want you to know I forgive you. And I want to say to every person who has anyone in their life who hurt them, there's a pretty good chance they took it as far as they knew how. And you may never like or appreciate that they could only take it that far, but forgive them if you can, because it's good for you. And there's a pretty good chance they took it as far as they could.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Sincerely Show. I'm your host, Katherine Dudtschak. The Sincerely Show is a place. It's a journey and it's a movement. It's a movement towards a life lived sincerely. And it's a journey. It's a journey that travels through some of the heaviest and darkest periods of our life. It's a journey that travels through awareness, awakening, and wholeness. And it's a journey that travels through to calling, to service, to this inner longing to make a difference in the lives of others. And it's a place. It's a place of joy. It's a place of curiosity. It's a place of love. It's a place of psychological safety and belonging. Welcome to The Sincerely Show. Again, I'm your host, Katherine Dudtschak. Let's begin. It is extra special to welcome my dear friend, Dr. John Izzo, to The Sincerely Show today. John, welcome.
Katherine, Katie, it is great to be here, and I'm really excited about our conversation and to be a part of your podcast.
Well, it's a real honor. As our guests may not know, John is referenced in my book, Sincerely Katherine, in the leadership chapter, Leadership of the Future chapter. And John, we met, I don't know, it feels like 15 to 20 years ago.
I think maybe even more, but it's been at least 20, I think.
Yes, it's been a beautiful journey of shared purpose. Why don't you, John, introduce yourself in a way that feels authentic to you?
And
then we'll dig into your life a little bit.
Well, when you said that you were going to begin with me introducing myself, I was thinking of, Robert Fulghum, who wrote Everything I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, said that he eventually changed his business card to just say Fulghum, just his name. And I kind of feel like earlier in my life, like if you asked me to introduce myself, I would say, oh, well, I'm an author and I've written these books and I'm a keynote speaker and I've, been a change agent for purpose and a more sustainable society in business and in life. And yet now I kind of want to say Izzo, right? But if I were to characterize myself, I like to think of myself as a public philosopher. A philosopher about life, a philosopher about business, a philosopher about the human journey and what it means to be human in this moment in time. And I do that in a variety of ways that all come down to Fulghum, Izzo. This is like who I am now, and so I can't name it as easily as once I did. So.
One of the lines, John, that I've heard that sticks with me is innocence is the highest form of wisdom. And so when you say you can name it less easily than you once did, it's this ability to live in wonder and awe and curiosity, which you do. Talk to us more about philosophy and a public philosopher, and what do those words mean for you?
Well, I think everything, if I just, in the 40 years that I've been then working with businesses and speaking all around the world and coaching and meeting and in my research, interviewing and so many people, I really believe that whether it's in a business, in our life, in society, the outer experience we're having is a manifestation of the inner life.
Yes.
And it's true at every fractal level. So what you're manifesting in your life is a manifestation of your inner life. What an organization manifests is a manifestation of its inner life. And all the way up to the whole of humanity now, that I believe what we're manifesting is a manifestation of our inner life. So in that way, I think philosophy is very practical. I mean it not in the, let's go study Kierkegaard and Hegel and, Descartes and see if we can figure out, the meaning of life. It's really a much more grounded philosophical journey, which is, can we understand the inner sanctum that is driving the outer results that we're seeing? And so that's what interests me. And particularly now, I believe this is a time in the human journey where we need very much to be taking that journey. I mean, just not to get too deep into it, but just look at the headlines right now. Wars in several places. We thought maybe we were done with war, climate accelerating, and our relationship with the earth deteriorating by the moment. A sense of a deterioration of trust in institutions around the globe. And so that's what we're manifesting. So what's interesting, and then a new technology, AI, that we think might make us pets. Now I have my own thoughts on whether that's the most likely scenario. But think of all of that and then ask, what is the inner life that is manifesting that? And anyway, that's what I mean by philosophy.
I love it. And what you're earmarking is, you said something to me a few months back, and you said something to me the effect, the world needs new churches. And I think what you meant was places of reflection, places of coming together, places of pause. So similarly, what I'm hearing from you is philosophy as a pause, as a place to reflect, as a place to look deeper. Where did this start for you? Let's talk about some of the books that you've written and some of the work that you've done. You and I met 20 years ago. I think it was your first book on purpose was released not long before we met. So you've been on a path of exploring meaning and purpose for some time. Walk us through some of the work that you've done over the course of over that 40-year period. Talk about the work, and then we'll go deeper into your life after that.
Yeah. We can later we can go to like how I got to that point, but let's start the point that you referenced. In 1994, I had just left as a vice president of a healthcare consulting company in the U.S., left in a hostile takeover where the president, my boss, was fired overnight and sent out without cause, and the rest of us given contracts we couldn't sign. So I left and went out on my own. And I wrote my first book with my colleague and friend Eric Klein called Awakening Corporate Soul. And it really, the book was, and at the time in the early 90s, Toms of Maine had just written his book, The Soul of Business, I think was the name of it. But really almost no one was writing about this idea that there was a deeper well that could be accessed at work, from people, that wasn't just about money, that wasn't just about even how they were treated, that there was something more deep, soul, that connection, community, contribution. So Eric and I, he was a yogi. He was, a Buddhist
I didn't know
yogi.
that.
Yeah, and I had been a Presbyterian minister. We'll get into that later, before I got into organization development. So we used the spiritual traditions of East and West as a language to understand how business could access a deeper well from people. And one of our first quotes in the book was a quote that Carl Jung used to have outside of his retreat, his office in his retreat. It said, "God is present whether called or not." And here we meant God not with the big G, the God, but that the spiritual dimension of meaning, of community, of purpose was there waiting in every worker, in every workplace, if it could be accessed. And we suggested that the very language of business was antithetical to the soul. So that really began my career. And I always say at the time it was very lonely, because it was kind of a novel idea. And I would have the book with me, as I did in those days when you have your first book. I would take it with me to airports, let it sit out on the table in first class. Anyway, I wasn't in first class then, I was in coach. But anyway, and I remember one woman from the airline seeing it and going, "Isn't that like awakening corporate soul? That's an oxymoron. No corporations have soul." Or another funny story is a speakers bureau was recommending me to a big bank, not the one you used to work for. And they shortlisted me to be the keynote speaker at their big leadership event. And they sent a copy of the book. I'll make a long story short. Then the guy who was planning the meeting, who was a senior VP, said, "Send me 10 more copies," which seems like a good sign. But then the bureau didn't hear from him for weeks and weeks. So finally he got a hold of him and said, "Are you going to book Dr. Izzo?" He said, No, we're not going to do that. And he said, "Well, didn't you like the book?" "I love the book." He said, "In fact, making me think I should quit my job and go work somewhere else." He said, "So I'm giving it to everyone I know. But," and I quote, he said, "it would not be good for my career to suggest a speaker at this event who had soul in the title of his book." Now, Katie, we've come a long way since then, and in some ways not very far at all. But that's how the journey began for me. I was an accidental tourist, really, into the business world. And that book catapulted me into a deeper conversation of what it meant to work and to lead people who work.
So when you left that executive job and the restructuring, it called you, it spoke to you, and you began this journey. Talk us through the layers that followed over the 40-year period. And, for you, the different books are a good way to do that. Mm-hmm. Walk us through in a way that feels right for you, how this kind of deeper soul level, purpose level, it's not even an idea. It's a way of being for humanity. How did that unfold over the 40-year period?
Well, one of the things I encourage people to do in their own life, your listeners, is sometimes you look at your life and it looks like a scatter plot. There are all these different things that you've done. But if you really look at it, reflect on it deeply, you'll see the signal through the noise, the line that is there, right? So someone might look at my career, and say, "Oh, first he was a Presbyterian minister. Then he went back and got a PhD and, got this fascination around work. And then he became this corporate speaker and consultant and advisor to big businesses. And then along the way, he wrote this self-help book called The 5 Secrets You Must Discover Before You Die, and another one called The 5 Thieves of Happiness. Oh, and then he was writing about stepping up, how taking responsibility changes everything. Oh, then back to the purpose revolution, right? And people might say, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Right? He's all over the place. But if you look at the signal through the noise, and it took me a while to see the signal through the noise, it was always about getting people to be more intentional and again, at every fractal level for individuals, including myself, because we all take people on the journey we most need to go on, right? So, if you're writing about time management, it's probably because you struggle with managing time, right? So it was, how do we find meaning? How do we find purpose? How do we translate that into outcomes that we want in our life, whether it's our individual life or our collective life? So the signal I see through the noise is trying to get individuals, leaders, and society to be more intentional about choosing a constructive path for myself and for others. And so while it looks like noise, all these different things, that's the throughput. And so, my purpose, I think, has and always will be to shift the mindset and consciousness required for planet and people to thrive, right? Now and in the future, right? And I've wanted that both for the individuals that I've worked with or spoken to, all the way up to the biggest systems in the world. And again, I'm humble. Like all of us, I'm just playing my little part, right, in this big journey that we're all on. But that's the signal through the noise to me. And there is one more signal. My publisher says that my gift, and I think it's true, is going out and hearing the story of what's working, synthesizing it, and then telling that story. I actually don't think I'm a big innovator in terms of like a brand new idea, but I think I'm incredibly good at listening to the story and finding the signal through the noise. And whether it was Awakening Corporate Soul, what's the signal through the noise of companies that emerge? When I wrote Value Shift, what's the signal through the noise? It was in the 2000 about the changing values at work, before a lot of people were saying, oh, Gen Y and Gen Z, X are different. When I wrote The Purpose Revolution, what's the signal through the noise? And even the 5 Secrets, where I interviewed these 250 people who had only one thing in common: they had been identified as the wisest older person someone knew. 250 people with 18,000 years of life experience. What was I trying to do? Find the signal through the noise of what was the commonality where people found happiness and meaning through a long life. So again, I think that's my gift, and I tried to bring that gift in all the work that I've done.
Talk about those 5 secrets for a bit, John. It feels really appropriate to understanding the power of story and finding service or servitude or contribution for humanity, which is, as you and I have spoken about before, is kind of the highest form of affirmation or reward, is to know that you're making a difference in the lives of others. So talk about the 5 secrets.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you asked that. I would like people, as they're listening, to think about remember, I'm big on every fractal level. It's the same. If you know anything about science, almost all living organisms, they're in fractals. Look at a broccoli sometime, and you'll see that every piece of the broccoli is a fractal of the whole thing. So I want people to think about that, because as you think about the secrets to a happy life are the same things that are the secret to a happy societal life. The things that are the secrets to a happy societal life are probably the secrets to a thriving planet, right? Or a thriving business, right? So, when I interview these people, and I won't spoil it by telling people all the secrets, because here's what happens. If I just told you the 5 secrets, people go, I know that. And I always tell people, whether you know something is not unimportant. It's, are you living around it, right? So we know all kinds of things that we don't actually live or live into, but what brought to life were the stories in these, but I'll share several of the secrets to illustrate what I mean. One of the secrets was give more than you take. I discovered that happy people who live a long and happy life, were mostly givers, not takers. They got up in the morning asking, what can I give to the world, not what can I take from the world? And if you think about it, at every fractal level, a business that gives more to the world than it takes will ultimately be successful. One that extracts value will ultimately fail, even if it looks successful in the short term. A society that takes more from the ecosystem that it gives will ultimately collapse, even if it, whether it's the Roman Empire or, the British Empire, right? If at some point you take more from the system than you give, it will collapse because that's the way of the world. Another one of the secrets that really stands out for me, and again, I'll make the connection, was about being true to your most authentic self. Because you see, it's so easy to lead someone else's life, is what these people told me. And many of them told me about how they were trying to live their parents' life or their friend's life or society's life. But when they finally decided to live the life most true to them, which is different for each one of us, something profound shifted. And I think the same thing is true even for a business. The most authentic purpose for a business is to add value to its stakeholders. And if you look at almost every successful business, it was successful first because it added value to its ecosystem. Now later, it may have been perverted and focused only on the numbers or immediate, but it became successful because it added value to its ecosystem, which is its most truest self for a business. And even as a species, my friend Janine Benuis, who's a pretty well-known biologist, I asked her once, what's the purpose of nature? And she said, well, we can't ask nature what its purpose is. But if we could watch nature and ask what's its purpose, we would have to say its purpose is to extend and improve life itself. So almost every part of nature acts as if its purpose is to make sure life keeps going and gets better. So I believe, Katie, the most authentic self of humanity is to make sure that life itself becomes better and more complex and goes on. So think about it right now. Is humanity acting in accordance with our truest self? No. I would argue not. And why, therefore, do we have so much unhappiness? And such bad outcomes because we're not acting like our most authentic self. So anyway, I could go on, but that's kind of what I love about the book. That's again the signal through the noise. It's a book about happiness. So people, the book's in 35 languages, and millions of people have read the book, and it makes me happy, right? They had a little happier life, but there's a fractal there again for me, and that's the part for me that's
what I love about. John, what I love about these two secrets is they literally sit on top of each other, right? To be whole, the authentic self is to be whole, starting at a soul or an essence level, not what your parents told you to be, not what your boss told you to be. That's the performative self, not the authentic whole self. And then the other is to be of service, which is the highest form of honor, is to be a giver, is to contribute to through love, through kindness, to life. They're really complementary to one another.
Yeah, I was thinking, and by the way, that's why I love sincerely, right? The whole concept of your thing. And what I'm saying, extend it to the whole human enterprise. Are we being our most sincere self? As a business, are we being our most sincere self, which is to add value, which therefore value comes back to us? But one of my favorite stories in the book was a native chief who I interviewed. And by the way, to get into the 250 people, we had over 2,000 nominations. We asked people this simple question. Who's the one older person you know? And we didn't define old. By the way, I know now 60 is about when people think you're old because nobody under 60 got nominated. Said, who's the one older person you know who has found true happiness and has something to teach us? That's all. That's the only criteria. And 2,000 nominations chose 250 people. This one native chief from the BC coast, one of the people we interviewed, he told a wonderful story when he was young, and they would have, when the salmon were running, he and his brothers would go out with his father to catch the salmon. And he said one year when he was maybe 15 years old, the salmon were running so amazingly that within like an hour and a half, their boat was filled with salmon. And they came back to the shore, and all the three brothers, who were all teenagers, were just filled with testosterone. Right. And as soon as they emptied the nets as quickly as they could and said, Dad, let's go out. Let's catch some more. And he said his father said to them, no, we have enough. And he said, but you see those people over there, they're having some problems with their nets. And those people over there having some problems with their boat. Why don't we go and help them so they can have enough? And he said, at 15, I didn't want to do that, right? Because like I wanted to go out and catch more fish. He said, but at the end of the day, what really made me so happy that day was not that I caught all that fish, but I had helped all those other people. And he said, and what a great metaphor for, like, again, us as a whole society now and as leaders, right? If we have enough, the true purpose comes from making sure that everyone has enough, right? And it is in giving that we receive most deeply. So I always loved that story. I forgot it until you asked, but it was a beautiful story, you know?
I was going to ask you to share perspectives on indigenous traditions and culture, and you walked into it naturally. And this next question fits with this. Define what you mean by intentional. You know, because it's very easy for us to say, well, I have an intention to acquire X or to acquire Y. When you talk about this journey to essence or wholeness or service, you said living intentionally. So what does that mean for you? What does it feel like and look like to live intentionally?
Well, I think let's go back to the truest self, of course. Because first, what's the source of our intentions? And when we have intentions all the time, goals, you know, things we intend to how to be, right? And the first question is, what's the source of your intentions? And the source, you might say, oh, the source of my intentions is my values, my most authentic self. But I think all of us would agree, sometimes our intentions come from other places.
Yeah.
The expectations of others, right. Keeping up with the Joneses, the stock market, price tomorrow when we report our earnings, right? So where does the intention come from? And I believe our most sincere and useful intentions, first of all, come from our truest source, our values and our most authentic self. Now, so what I mean by intentional, one is, so first we need to know where those intentions are coming from, to be honest with ourselves. Where is that intention coming from? But then second, to me, intentional is to live by choice, not by whim or wind. By wind, I mean just the forces that put us in a direction. By whim, just what I feel like in the moment, right? Or by accident. And it comes from a very deep place for me because, and this gets into my story a little bit, but when my father died at 36 years old of a sudden heart attack when I was 8 years old. And I remember very vividly the moment that I was playing in the street at 8 years old in Staten Island, New York, playing sports with my friends. And my mother called me in. I remember her sitting on the bed so she could be at eye level with me. And she said, "Johnny, I have some bad news for you. Your father died today." But the interesting thing, Katie, is my next words out of my mouth were, "Is it okay if I go back outside and play?" And people say, "Well, why did you react that way?" Well, I reacted that way because my father and mother split up when I was only 6 months old, and my father lived 2 hours away from me. But other than one time, apparently, when I was a year old, I didn't see him in that entire 8 years, even though he only lived 2 hours away. Now, at 8 years old, I didn't realize how this would impact my journey. But later in life, of course, I started judging my father. What a bad person he must have been, to have lived 2 hours away and not seen his son. But then as I got older and wiser, I realized, no, he just wasn't intentional. The more I learned about my father, I realized he wasn't an evil man. He just didn't think deeply enough about the choices he was making. So I think much of my journey to help others be intentional grew out of the impact that someone not being intentional. Now, he could have just been a jerk, but everything I found out about it, he wasn't a jerk. He just
Of course not.
he just wasn't intentional. And so that's what I mean by intention. I believe if he had been acting out of his truest self, his essence as just a human being, probably his own values, because I know the family he came from, he might have made different choices. And probably if he had time, he might have made different choices. I'll never know that. But so that's what I mean. Do our intentions come from our truest values, our deepest sense of our most authentic self? And then are we living to those values? Do our intentions align with those values? And therefore the choices we make come from that. And so again, my whole life has been really about getting all of us, including myself, to make intentional choices. Maybe because I believe in human goodness. See, I believe our most authentic self, with some rare exceptions. And those are usually people who are either damaged physically. We know now the brains of sociopaths are often literally different. It's their brains. It's not, or their upbringing was so abusive but that I believe at our heart is goodness. Our heart as a species is goodness. And so when we're acting from our most authentic self, good things happen, but our intentions often don't come from the most authentic self, or it just happens by whim, as I said, or wind. And if we had made more conscious choices, we might have produced better outcomes. And simple example, if you ask every person in the human race right now, would you like to create a relationship with the rest of the planet so that life itself will be poor, including the lives of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren 100 or 200 years from now because of how we acted? No, I don't want that. And yet that's what we're producing. So, it's quite possible for us to produce things that are not aligned with our deepest values or intentions. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, it is a through line, and it's why you're here, and it's why you and I connected many years ago, John, is that you have a deep love and a deep care of what humanity is capable of when we are intentional. And, thank you for opening the door into where it all began. Talk to us more about your childhood, and because I think there's more layers to this of how your own, a term that I've been spending time researching in the last few weeks is inner authority. You can have an inner authority without intention and deeper awareness that could be fueled by ego or fear. The more intentional we are and the deeper we go, the more grounded that inner authority is from that place of goodness, from that place of coherence. So talk more about your childhood, your mother. What was those formative years like for you?
Yeah, and as people are listening, think about your own story as you hear mine.
Exactly.
What's the humus? Humus is comes from the word ground, literally from earth, right? And so what's the ground from which you became who you are? And for all of us, there are things that have shaped us that we may want to integrate in a different way. And there's other things we ought to be deeply grateful for that shaped us. So the other thing about my childhood, and again, I encourage people to hear my story, but to think about your story, because that's what it's really about. And by the way, society has a story too, and we can get to that. So what's the things that shaped me? First, I believe we all have a way in the world that was here before anything shaped us. Call it genes, call it, spirit, whatever it is. Here's how I know that, Katie. When I was I grew up born in 1957, height of the baby boom, a neighborhood filled with boys. For some reason, only one girl in the neighborhood, which may have been good because I was raised by my mother and grandmother. If I had enough female energy, so the neighborhood was filled with boys. And maybe you can never have enough female energy, but anyway, so filled with boys. And I remember my boyfriends used to get great glee, this is when I was a really young boy, of pouring hot water down ant holes and boiling hot water. And even as a young child, Katie, my heart broke for those ants. And I have no idea why. I don't think that came from anything in nurture. It was my nature. We all have a nature. So you might ask, and if you have kids, you know our kids have different natures. My oldest daughter was born with angst. My youngest daughter was born zen. They're in their 30s now. One still has angst and one still has zen, right? But they also had other things that were true to themselves. But what shaped me? 3 things come to mind. First, I grew up in a very religious family. Not a church-going family, interestingly. They sent me off to church, but they didn't have a lot of use for the church. A deeply religious family. But unlike some people, I had no religion to recover from. I always say the Jesus that hung on the wall in my home was a loving, forgiving, take up your cross and serve the world Jesus. It was not a Jesus talking about you're going to go to hell, you're damned if you don't believe in me. So I grew up, with a grandfather who prayed every night by the side of his bed, and a mother who prayed every night and encouraged me to pray, and who said life is about service. And that came from my religious tradition. I'm grateful for it. The second thing is my mother was a deeply kind and compassionate person to everyone. When I was young, it was a white working class neighborhood, firemen, police officers, that kind of thing. And one black family moved into the neighborhood when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. That people were pretty welcoming of them. But all my friends were not allowed to go to inside their house, which is interesting. They could play in the street. So one day they invited me to go to dinner. And I asked my mother, can I go to dinner at Howie's house? And she said to me, why would you ask that question? I'm tearing up even. She said, why would you ask that question?
Oh.
She said, of course you can go there. And don't ever ask that question again. The other thing I remember is one time I stole a piece of candy from Mr. Miller's grocery store. Mr. Miller was to me, he was this bald, meanest son of a bitch. Right, as a child, we all were afraid of Mr. Miller. I stole a piece of candy from Mr. Miller's store. And my mother saw the candy and said, where did you get that? And I'm never a good liar. I confessed I had stolen it. She dragged me 3 blocks by my ear to the front of Mr. Miller's store. And she said, Johnny, you're going to go inside, give the candy back to Mr. Miller, and apologize to him that you have stolen. Can you imagine, I'm a young kid. Mr. Miller is this mean SOB that everyone is afraid of. I have to go up, put the candy on the counter. I never forgot that moment. So I inherited from her deep values around kindness, compassion, be a good human being. And then finally, no doubt was shaped by the fact that I didn't have a father. And in those days, I was really only knew one other person who had come from a broken family. Now, and we didn't call it broken now, but it was a broken family, right? I was the only one who had a single mom except for one other person. And I not only felt weird, but I was in some ways in judgment of my own family as inadequate, as, that shaped me in a lot of ways, right? And it took me years to see the beauty in my own family, right? And it's a harsh judgment we make of the self when we judge the people who are loving us, right? But years of therapy and reflection and writing books and by the time my mother died, we had a very deep affection for each other and a beautiful goodbye that we had for many years. But anyway, it was so that I hope that helps. Those 3 things: my religious upbringing, the loving Jesus on the wall, the deep value around compassion and kindness and not judgment of others, no matter who they were or where they came from. And then finally, just my own feelings of inadequacy growing up in that single parent home in a time when it was very odd and unusual. And I was always an odd duck, too. I was a philosopher even when I was young, and there weren't a lot of boy philosophers around me. So it took me a while to find my peeps, too. So
thank you, John.
I feel like I just opened up the kimono there. There we go.
I know you are. And I'm going to.
But again, I encourage the listener, say, oh, that's an interesting story about John, but what's your story
Exactly.
that has shaped you? And how are you still reacting to it or integrating it? And are you living deeply into that most authentic, the John who hated it when the ants were being...
I describe us as having three selves. There's our lived experience self. There's our physical and inherited self, genetics, epigenetics, and then there's our essential self, our essence, our soul. John, I've known you for quite some time. I can picture your heart as the water's being poured down the anthole. You are a deeply feeling, empathic soul. And you are deeply curious, which is the philosopher within you. Yes. Those are yours. And some spirit, the divine, whatever you want to call it, put you into a home that allow you to experience the three things that you just walked us through. And, those are partly your lived experience, and those are partly your genetics and epigenetics and inherited self. You also were somehow given a gift of growing up in a matriarchal home that aligned beautifully to your own natural way of being, your essence. Talk about the word integration. You said this word earlier, and I will replay a story for you and for our guests. John, you and I had the privilege of being in a peer group for a few years together. And in one meeting, we would go in camera or we go into breakouts. And I saw a photo. John held his phone up and you showed a photo of your 4-year-old self.
Yeah.
And that act of you showing me that you were honoring your inner child and learning to love your inner child resulted in me going into my basement of my house after I came out. This was a couple of years after I came out. And I went and looked for a photo. I remembered it vividly of my 4-year-old self. And I was going to put the picture of that person on of me. That day I didn't find that photo. I eventually found that photo. But what happened that day was I went through 50 years of family photos. Aspects of my life that I had blocked off. And I cried and I cried and I cried as I walked through 50 years of life. And I emerged honoring, not blocking out, but honoring those first 50 years of life. And it was the first time in about a decade that I felt more whole and more complete. So your 4-year-old self photo was the catalyst for my journey to integrating my, not male, but my masculine self, my feminine self, and the life that I've lived so far. So you don't know, back to your point about relate to your own life, you don't know when your story has an effect on someone else that is deep and profound. So I thank you for that, John. I honor you and I thank you for that gift. Talk about integration for you. Talk about reconciliation, integration for you on your journey.
It's funny, just as an aside, I was laughing because, first of all, I'm glad that had that impact for you. And I was thinking there's only 3 pictures of people in my office. One is a picture, that 4-year-old picture of myself. Well, I said there's 4 pictures. There's a family gathering there. Me and that 4-year-old boy. Picture behind me of my mother. And a picture of my father, which, by the way, I only put up a year ago because I was only ready at 67 years old to put him up there and realize that he was a part of me and that I'd be grateful. I thank him sometimes. I say thank you because my genes, who I am. It's like you, and thank you for the fact that you forced me in a way to be even more kind to others, more aware of others' hurts, more intentional about helping others be intentional, right? And to forgive him, right? So anyway, so I believe in surrounding yourself with things that remind you of who you are and who you want to be. And those are not always the same. Sometimes therefore, what is integration? Integration to me, maybe at the most basic level, is where there is alignment between who I am, my truest nature, how I live, and how I think. In other words, where there's a sense that they're not in conflict with each other, right? Because what's the opposite of integration is disintegration. These things are somehow, well, I'm really a person who is about purpose, but I'm in a company that is just about profit. I'm really a person who is about forgiveness, but I'm in all these unforgiving relationships. I'm a person who is curious, but I'm in a job or a life now that deadens my curiosity with sameness every day, right? So to me, we understand integration. I understand what is the opposite is these things are not integrated. They're integrated, right? There's a sense of alignment between who I am, who I want to be, how I want to live my life. And I always think of there's integration at the daily and at the big level. And sometimes we only think about the big level. I meet people who maybe at the big level, they're integrated, their values and who they are aligned with their work and their way in the world. But on the daily way, if you said how you're spending your time and living your life every day, is that aligned? And sometimes people are integrated at the deepest level, but they find in the daily level, they're literally living a life out of, they say family is the most important thing, but they hardly have time for their family. Or they say it's important for me to contribute, but well, my daily life is not. So even though I may in the big sense, I'm donating money, but my daily life is not contributory, right? And I could go on, but you get the idea. That to me is what integration is. And we feel disintegration always feels, I think we feel out of sorts when we're not integrated. We feel, like something's, it makes sense because something's rubbing versus think of an engine where all the parts are where they should be. You have a hum, not a clang.
Yeah, the word that emerges for me, John, when you describe integration is coherence. Coherence from your essential self through your physical and inherited self, through your lived experience and outward into the world daily and over time as a way of being. It's beautiful. Where are you now? Talk about life now.
Yeah.
We're never done growing. We're never done awakening. We're never done adjusting and recalibrating. Where's life at for you now? What's the last couple of years looked like?
Yeah. Well, it's been a period of transition for me in a lot, as you know, because we talk. And a couple of things have happened in the last few years. One is I left a nonprofit that I helped found, which maybe we'll talk about later, around making a better world where men and boys can be more constructive for themselves and for others. And just about 3 years ago now, this June coming up, I left that work, which had taken up about half my time for 8 years. And after many years of keynote speaking, 70, 80 times a year, I deliberately decided to throttle back and ask, what do I want to do now with this next, decade of my life? And it's been interesting because I'm very much exploring now many things. I'm doing daily Instagram and TikTok videos on issues of society. You can follow me if people who are listening, if they want to. I'm involved in a lot of work now around democracy and how do we heal polarization and bring people together. And really, also, I'm kind of in a tinkering phase too. I just recorded my first song in Los Angeles called My Last Call. People can find it on Spotify and Apple. I've always loved music, and with the collaboration with my friend Jer in Hollywood, and a guy named Johnny Schnell who played with B.B. King, recorded my first song. I'm starting work on a novel, and the point is, I'm really leaning into this kind of more artistic part of my life, and at the same time, very interested in these societal hacks. Society needs a shift right now, and I'm asking what role might I play in that. And I've had some physical challenges, as you know, in the last few years, and these are, I always see, at 68, these are like the shots over the bow. This is like a reminder that this will happen now, right? And so one must now be aware of that. I'm healthy now, but something else may happen, right? And so live now, which of course all the 5 secrets people told me, live now. This is the moment, and so now I know what they were talking about. So I don't know if that helps. And it's not. You were talking earlier about one of my favorite lines from a David Whyte poem that I shared with you when you were kind of journeying a bit ago, about when there's a moment in your life when you're not sure what comes next. And some of you listening or watching may be in that moment. You don't know what comes next, and it's frightening not to know. And there's 2 big dangers of not knowing. One is that your need to know will push you too quickly to commit to something that isn't integrated. The other danger is that you'll do nothing. You'll just give up, right? And there's that line in that David Whyte poem about waiting long enough for the current of the story to float you out. And in many ways, I'm kind of in that moment now, Katie, where I'm having to be very patient to see what's the big thing I'm going to commit to in the next decade. And it's not clear to me yet. I know there's something coming, but I've been waiting and probably for about a year, little over a year now, waiting, and waiting for something to be strong enough to carry me out. But in the meantime, as you see, I'm not sitting idle. I'm still doing speaking, but less. I'm still doing videos every day, and I'm still working on a novel and writing songs. So and playing tennis soon again.
Well, we could probably have a debate about whether you're waiting or whether you're actually following a current already.
Yeah.
And because there's beauty in you embracing your creative side or your more feminine side as you already are, whether it's novel, whether it's singing, and there's beauty in that. And which one grows, which one takes you where. Yet what stands out for me, John, is your essential self, your soul. It's still evident.
Yes.
This deeply loving, compassionate soul that is incredibly curious and expressive. Those 3 aspects of your essence that were there before body or genetics is still alive and active in you. So you're honoring your essence, even though you may not feel like you've drifted back out into the big stream. And to me, from my experience, that is the pathway to the stream, is by just honoring your essence and being curious and present.
Yeah, it's a great, it's John Lennon who famously said, life is what happens to you while you're planning to do something else. But I said earlier when we were talking before coming on today that I might share a poem And ironically, you said stream, so I think it's a sign from the universe I should share this poem. I was in Ireland on an experience with a poet and a group of people in June of last year. And the poet said this line that really struck me. He said, that he had this thought about a year ago. What if his work was done and the rest was just gravy now? And that day I wrote this poem on a walk. And in the poem, there's an image that I remember of myself as a very young boy. I grew up in New York City. There wasn't a lot of nature, but there was an old home for sailors, like people who had been in the Navy who could go there when they were old. It was like an old person's home, and it had like nature around it, including this little stream. And we would sneak in as young kids and go sit by this stream. And it was, for us, it was enchanting because there was no nature around us, real nature, right? So I wrote this poem. And again, as people listen, it's not about John. If you were to write a poem about yourself as a child that could instruct you now, even if you're not a poet, what would the poem say? So just listen, I'll read the poem. What if your work is truly done? What if your work is truly done? What if you let go of all the grand ambition that has carried you and tortured you all this way? Surely, surely, more has come to you than you could have reasonably expected, yet always seemingly so much less than you had unreasonably longed for. What if you just lived more generously, became again that warm, inviting, curious boy who once sat by a tiny stream, alive to the sacred beauty of tiny things? What if you became small enough that the world could find you again, whether you needed it to or not? What if you became again that tiny boy curious boy who once sat by a tiny stream, alive to the sacred beauty of tiny things? What if you became small enough that the world could find you again, whether you needed it to or not? And that poem has kind of become my guide, and it's very much aligned with what you said. So.
You live, John. I've admired you forever. You live from your essence, and you know what your essence is. I want to go into a couple of areas, given the world that we live in, that you've talked about earlier. So first, let's talk about this men's initiative that you're involved with. And let's also talk about you healing and honoring your father. And I didn't know that you had put his photo on your wall, which is beautiful, John. And I'm shivering and I have tears for you. Our healing journeys and growth journeys are never done. So talk about the men's initiative. Talk about your dad and what was the mission and purpose and lessons behind that work.
So 8 years ago, my friend and colleague, David Kuhl, had gone on sabbatical and came back with this idea that he wanted to start a center around men and boys, because of a genesis of two things. One is that it was clear that men and boys were struggling all around the world, that more men were dying by suicide than ever, that many young boys were lost, but also that, and falling behind, and boys are falling behind in a whole variety, in grade point averages, in career, in relationships. Boys and men are falling behind in a whole variety of ways. But the second thing is that obviously so much of what has happened in the world that's not what we want has been perpetuated by men and boys, if we're honest, whether it's violence, physical and verbal, whether you could argue that in some ways the whole relationship we have with the earth is a very masculine, not associated with men, but not unique to men, but it's a masculine way of being in the world. So when I came back from I did my own self-imposed sabbatical about a year after his, and we were having dinner, and he was talking about what he was doing, and I said, well, David, maybe I need to help. So I joined and devoted about half of my time for the next 7.5 years to the men's initiative, later named Blueprint, still exists. And we went on a journey to both see if we could help men and boys be different, and did all kinds of things from working with the young men in sports at places like Stanford and West Point, the military academy, to a program that still exists for firefighters and police officers, both men and women, to research on what was happening with men and boys. And so, it was really, it's important work, because I remember when Putin invaded Ukraine, and Janice and I both have really big hearts. The biggest thing we share in common, which is sometimes almost always good and sometimes bad, is both of our hearts really break around pain, whether it's an animal or humans. And I remember the night they invaded Ukraine, she just said to me, John, these people were just trying to live their lives. Can you imagine now, just this person just decides they want, and what, 4+ years later, it's still going on, right? Get your head around that, right? And that night I was so angry, and I was angry at men, at Putin as a manifestation of them. I said, oh, it's always men. It's not always men. It's almost always men, right? And I'm not putting down men. I'm a man myself. I love men, but so that's where it came from. And it's really important work that needs to be done. Not judgment of men, but helping men find that integration. Because do I think men are inherently evil? No. I think men have the same goodness that women have, of course. And do I think men inherently want to do bad in the world? No, right? And they certainly don't want to fall behind, right, in terms of their own journeys of success and integration. But something has happened with boys in our society and men, and has happened in many ways around the globe. So we wanted to see if we could help heal that. And I left because I felt I had contributed what I could contribute to it, and was ready to move on to other things. But I still think it's very important work, and I'd like to think I'm still doing it in other ways.
John, you distinguish something, and I want to put a pin in it. Being male or female or in between is not the same as masculine and feminine. Masculine and feminine are energies, their characteristics, my senses at a soul level or at an essence level, which is very different than being male or female. And you were doing some pretty profound work with groups of men, allowing them to grieve, to feel, to express themselves more wholly, more completely. And I don't mean holy as in religion. I mean more completely, which is a big theme of our conversation today. What was that like to facilitate and to witness, whether it's the fire department or the police department or West Point, grown men able to express themselves in a more whole and more complete way?
Well, a couple things. One is it made me realize how much men hold within them.
Exactly. And
is not released. I remember hearing someone say something years ago. It was a African-American man who grew up in the Bronx. And he said his brother was, you'll see where I'm going with this, was killed in a firearm accident or something when he was a teenager. And they were burying him on Long Island. So they had to drive like hour and a half or 2 hours out to the cemetery to bury his brother. And he said he remembered the women were like weeping and gnashing, and he was just a little boy himself. And his father hadn't cried at all. Until on the way back, the women wanted to stop to the restroom and maybe get something to drink or something. And it was just him and his father left in the car. He was just a young boy. And his father started wailing. He said, but what I remember most are two things. First of all, he kept apologizing to me for crying. And second, he kept praising me for being so strong. And I tell that story because that's, I think, one of the things I discovered, especially with, midlife men and beyond, is this way in which all these emotions have been held inside. And to give men permission to speak of these things. For example, we know many men have experienced sexual abuse when they're children, but almost no men talk about it. A lot more women talk about it than men. It's tragedy for either, obviously, equal tragedy, right? But that men are less likely to talk about it because of the shame. Men carry a lot of shame about being strong and not being weak. And that story of that young man and his father, and the father not feeling any permission to grieve even his own son's death because he felt he had to be strong. Now, when we worked with young men, it was a little different. What struck me with the young men, because I think young men may be a little more, less grew up in that stoicism, version of masculinity. But still the young men, for example, at Stanford, I remember we worked with their championship soccer team, and one of the young men said, we don't have these conversations with each other. Because we were asking them questions around sexuality, around how they were in the world, around their intentions, and whether one of my favorite exercises, we would ask them to identify their core values of who they most want to be in the world, and then to rate themselves how much they felt they were actually showing up that way. And many of them said, no one has ever asked us that question, right? To claim who we want to be and to be honest with ourselves and then with someone else, because then we would have them share. And these people are on their team. These are not just strangers, and say, here's where I am aligned and here's where I am less aligned with who I want to be, right? People who could call you out on it, who could say, and you could invite to hold you accountable. So it was really quite beautiful to see men opening up in that way. And we need much more of that for men, for all of us, really. I would say it really wasn't men's work. It was human work that it just happens that men haven't done as much of, right?
Mm-hmm. For the men that are listening, what would be 2 or 3 pieces of insight or advice you would give them if they're not coherent, if they're not integrated, if they've not allowing themselves to express feelings? Many of these things come to roost, and you alluded to this at midlife and whatever you define midlife to be. What would those 2 or 3 lessons be that you would leave them with?
One lesson is find male friends that you can truly talk about your struggles with. And don't be shocked that they've been eager for you to do it, even if at first they seem to blush. I was young, almost all of my best friends were women. Maybe because of the way I grew up, but also I felt like men weren't as, really harder to connect. Now, the opposite is true. Most of my closest friends are men. And not that I still have many close female friends. I count you as a friend, Katie. But I have found comfort in the company of men, because I remember, no matter, I have daughters, but no matter how much I try, I will never understand what it's like to be a woman in the world. If I'm a person who feels in between, I will never understand what it's like to be a person who feels in between, right? If I'm a woman, no matter how much a woman tries, she will never fully understand what it's like to be a man, right? And so we need to be able to talk to other men. So that's the first thing, is find men you can talk to. The second thing is, don't let your friends get away with not talking. One of the people we work with at the Blueprint was a guy named Nathan Adrian, who is a 5-time gold medal winner swimmer from the United States. And I remember something Nathan said to me. He said, when you talk to your male friends, ask them how they are. And if they say they're fine, no, say, how are you really? In other words, don't let your friends get away with, oh, I'm fine. No, how are you really? And sometimes just that one question, how are you really, will be an invitation, right? And so I think those two things mostly. Find men that you can, and if you feel lonely, honor that, right? I think a lot of men are deeply lonely. The number of men who die within like 2 to 5 years after their spouse dies, men who are heterosexual and married to a woman, who die within 3 to 5 years if they don't remarry or reconnect in another intimate relationship, is not a statement about how helpless men are. It's about how much men are not there for each other and have not developed they often have the only one person in the world they're truly authentic with, which is their spouse. And let me tell you, men, they can't take it, right? It can't be the only one, that you're doing that. And sometimes men are not even doing it with their most intimate other, of course.
I still have the blessing of a handful of men in my life that have shown me, like you are, John, with us today, a level of vulnerability. And it is beautiful to be trusted with people's stories and with inner feelings, and to be witness to someone who's grieving things that they never grieved before. So I think your two perspectives of who you surround yourself with and how you call them into the conversation, I think are really helpful. Let's take this to a broader level. There's us, and then there's the world. You talked about democracy. There's several. You talked about it: information proliferation fueled by AI, exploitation of planet, social fracturing, economic divide are all fundamental forces. And they're playing out in fascism and authoritarianism today. What's your view of democracy? Is there an advanced version of democracy available to us? You and I both live in Canada, and we have a prime minister that is advocating that middle powers group together with international law and a common set of deep values founded in sustainability and human rights can be, not only a powerful force in the world, but ultimately a force for long term and a force for good. What's the work you're doing around democracy, and how do you think of where we're at in the world today and where to next?
Well, I think we have to begin with, democracy has a bad name now, which is interesting, right? Joe Biden, famously mused that it was still a question whether democracy was up to the challenges, facing it, right? And so first, the percentage of people who live in democracies was rising for most of the last 70 or 80 years. But in the last 15 years, it is now declining. So decreasing. So first of all, democracy is on the decline. And even societies that are, democracies, their democracies, many of them are deteriorating. Greater amounts of polarization, pendulum swings back and forth, from right to left. Inability of democracies to solve problems like climate change or war and peace, let alone, the folks who I just came from the big TED conference, and about a third of the talks, some of the best people in the world on AI. We desperately need worldwide governance of AI, and yet we can't even govern fisheries. In other words, our capacity to even govern across and within societies is deteriorating. So first, democracy is declining in sheer numbers and in the functioning of democracies. And yet, here's the interesting thing. We can't give up on democracy. Here's why. Because the societies in the world with the highest levels of human rights, equality for men and women and genders, the most human rights, whether it's freedom of speech or rule of law, are democracies. So we can't give up on. The reality is a healthy functioning democracy is self-correcting. Because again, if we believe in the goodness of people, we believe that if people know the truth and there are fair elections, countries self-correct. Look at Hungary, right? After years of, having a person who was moving towards dictatorship and beginning to deteriorate human rights, and a friend to, a place like this, Russia, that's invaded Ukraine cruelly, the country self-corrected, right? Democracies are they're not perfect, but they're self-correcting. That's why we can't give up on democracy. Now, the sources of the deterioration of democracy are complex. There's the reality that the system is producing outcomes that people don't want. Mm-hmm. Why did Donald Trump get elected in the United States? Because the system wasn't working for millions of Americans. Because people felt like Washington just had gridlock and wasn't in touch, right? And wasn't producing outcomes, and people felt dissed and dismissed, right? So loss of trust in institutions. Second, polarization driven both by social media, by echo chambers that we all live in, where we only hear news that aligns with our way of thinking, driven by powerful interests that have an interest in polarization, whether it's media outlets or even the politicians. Politicians have an interest in polarization because I want to win, therefore you must lose, so I want you to be polarized. So complex how we got here. What's the path out? It's a really important question. First, I'll say we don't know what the path out is, but I'll say you some things. One is we need to find ways to find common truth. Thomas Jefferson famously said that a functioning democracy depended on an informed populace, because he believed if people knew the truth, it would self-correct towards the right thing. But truth now is hard to find. Some interesting things that are going on in unusual places. X, owned by Elon Musk. Not giving Musk credit for this, but he's let it happen, so got to give him a little bit of credit, right? 2 experiments going on at X. One is something that is called community thoughts, something like that. What it is people post things and people start saying, this is not true. It's manufactured, or it's not completely true. If that post gets liked by enough people across the political spectrum, right, left, and middle, who usually disagree, who usually don't like the same things, it raises that post so that suddenly now people start seeing, oh, this is misinformation. When that gets raised to a certain level, it decreases people's likelihood to share that by 70%. So in other words, what they're doing is the algorithm is helping serve truth to us. Second new experiment they're doing is social media rewards outrage. So the more people like something and share it, the more it gets raised. They're experimenting now at X with if something is being liked by people across the political spectrum, the algorithm is automatically sharing it with more people, so that we're now seeing things where we have common ground. Now, I only use these as 2 experiments, because what we need to do is start experimenting with how people come to information. And AI, for all of its faults, AI has tremendous potential to bring us together. In Taiwan, for example, they're using AI now to bring people together to give the government input. But unlike the typical way where we just kind of echo and rage at each other, AI gives people a series of statements they can agree or disagree with that come from the community, and eventually find common ground, but not through outrage, but through the AI, in a way, curating the conversation. So there, in fact, I'm reading a book right now from a woman we'll have on I have a podcast called The Way Forward, a woman named Beth Novak, who's written a book about how AI could, basically help save democracy. So there's so many things we need to do, and AI will be an enabler as well as it could disable democracy. And that's the interesting thing about AI. AI has so much potential to bring us together. It also has so much potential to tear us apart. And we need to, back to intentions, we need to choose to use it well. And finally, and my friend Julian, who's at the Stimson Center, where I'm a fellow, it talks about that many liberals failed to recognize the genuine problems that weren't being addressed. Mm-hmm. So when when Kamala Harris ran, they said there was no inflation. We fixed it. People didn't feel that. There is no impact of the open border, but there was an impact, right? And so what happens is the failure of the system to recognize its own faults, and you know this because you were a business leader, Katie, is that if crap stinks and the leaders say it's roses, sooner or later the people are going to rebel and find another leader, right? And so I think instead of recognizing the legitimate problems that our democracy had produced, like gridlock, like haves and have-nots, we tried to dismiss it. And in the process, people said, let's go for someone who's an outsider, who had all the right problems identified and all the wrong answers, which is, by the way, the common thing in these people who've risen from the far right in democracies, and they're almost always elected first. Adolf Hitler was elected first, and I'm not comparing anyone at present with Hitler, but almost every dictator was elected first, with some exceptions, in that used to be democracies. Here's the point, is that they almost always identify the right problems. That's why people are attracted to them, but their answers are the wrong answers. But again, democracies, when allowed to self-correct, when there's truth, when we bring people together, when we have fair elections, democracies tend to self-correct. But those things are not true now. And so that's why in the United States right now, this capacity to keep people from voting is so important. Because if you can control information and shut down freedom of the press and freedom of information, and freedom of speech, if you can rig elections, democracies don't self-correct. That's why no matter what side you're on, you should always be afraid of truth disappearing and fair elections disappearing, because then democracies don't self-correct. Otherwise, it's the best system in the world. And where's the proof? Fewer democracies start wars. Well, we've got one starting one now, but maybe that's because it's not much of a democracy anymore, right? And so, democracies start fewer wars. They have better human rights, and over time create better outcomes for more people. So, generally that is true. There are always exceptions to the rule, but that's why I still believe in democracy, but we don't have a lot of healthy ones right now. And yes, countries like the United States and Canada and Australia and Europe, the middle powers will have to come together. And it's ultimately good, by the way, to have another center of power anyway. You know that old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we actually need dispersed power in the world. It's generally a good thing. In society, dispersed power is a good thing. Too much power in few hands almost always produces corruption.
It sounds, John, like
Sorry for that sermon, but that's how I see it.
Story a sermon is the foundation of Sincerely. Is the story in and of itself reveals hope, inspiration, meaning, and lessons. I'm sitting with all that you've shared with us today, John, and you've led us into your inner child and your life as a child, this deeply loving, sensitive, feeling child, soul that is deeply curious and deeply expressive, that was given a beautiful incubator with your mother and your grandmother to foster a set of values and love within you, and a set of experiences that also awoken parts of you about the experience of men, the imbalance in corporations, the imbalance that societies can get to when they're not coherent. And you started off by talking about the inner alignment or misalignment ultimately manifests in the outer misalignment, which I think are very profound and important points for us to all reflect on in how we're living in our own life stories. John, what's your wish for humanity? What's your wish for this world?
Yeah, before I get to that, thank you, Katie. And just to reinforce what you just said, we used to say at Blueprint, at the Men's Initiative, hurt people hurt people. You want men to not hurt people? We need to deal with the hurt. That's not excusing it, by the way.
No.
Hurt societies, hurt other societies, hurt species, hurt other species, right? That's that manifestation you're talking about. My wish is really that we, all of us, just recognize that this is a critical moment in human history, and that each one of us has to do our part. If we want less polarization, we must be more willing to deeply listen to those who disagree with us. If we want a more kind, compassionate society, we ourselves must be more kind and compassionate. If we want a society that's more sustainable, we ourselves must become more sustainable. But we also must speak out. We must speak truth, right? And my hope is, and I'm an optimist about life itself. My daughter, my oldest daughter, Lena, has a great line. Says, we know there's hope because we're still here. And maybe hanging on by a thread sometimes, but life is a powerful force, right? And we have that force within us, right? And so I'm an optimist, but still we must lean into this moment. We shouldn't, every generation, I think, thinks this is the most important time. I bet every generation thinks if we blow it, like the next generation's in trouble. Maybe that's a good thing, right? Because that's why it keeps going. Because each mother bear, each parent believes if I get it wrong, the game's over, right? But I think we are in Carl Sagan, I often quote Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, before he died 20-something years ago. They asked him if he was hopeful about the future of human evolution. And I love what he said. He said, if you could project me out 50 or 60 years, which now, by the way, would be somewhere around 2045. You could project me out 50 or 60 years, and we had neither blown ourselves up or destroyed the environment beyond repair. He said, I'm very hopeful about human evolution because I believe the trends in our way of thinking are in the right direction. But he said, I don't know if we will get through this window. And I think Sagan was a little too optimistic. I might be the next 60 or 70 years, right? But this is a critical window. And but all we can do is our part. Be kind. Be intentional. Ask, what's my work in the world? And still have an ear to the bigger things. We can't just I have so many friends who say, I don't watch the news anymore, right? Because it just depresses me. You shouldn't do it to the point that it depresses you. But we can't put our head in the sand because the world is calling us. And then we must answer that call. And especially if you're a leader, a formal leader. We're all leaders because we all have influence. But if you're a business leader or a government leader or have a platform like you do or I do, you can't be silent because silence is criminal when the future is in jeopardy. But I'm an optimist. But we're going to go through some hard times. No doubt about that. And I want to do one thing before we go. I didn't think I was going to do this, but I'm going to. I have honored my mother thousands of times over the years, and I'm not exaggerating. I have dedicated books to her. Everything I am is because of her. But this is my father in his Navy uniform, and I just want to say thank you, Dad, for bringing me into this world. And I want you to know I forgive you. And I want to say to every person who has anyone in their life who hurt them, there's a pretty good chance they took it as far as they knew how. And you may never like or appreciate that they could only take it that far, but forgive them if you can, because it's good for you. And there's a pretty good chance they took it as far as they could. And what I want to say to you, Dad, is, you know what? I'm not perfect, but I think I took it a little further than you. And all I hope is that I will help the next generation, not just my family, but every person I meet, take it just a little further. And you know what? If you do that, then you've done something good in the world. So everybody, just make sure everybody takes it a little further and forgive those who took it as far as they could. even if it had consequences for you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, John. What you shared with us today is a beautiful journey where you've continued to honor your essence, that curious philosopher within you, this deeply sensitive, loving soul within you, and this beautiful storyteller, expressive soul that's within you. And you've honored your whole life, and you've shared with us a way of going about healing and turning hurts into service, whether it's the Men's Initiative or whether it's democracy or whether it's the work you've done in the corporate world around purpose and finding the soul within leaders and within companies. And you continue to do it. And so whether you're in the eddy or back out in the stream is not really what matters here. What mattered is that you're living from your own wholeness and from your own integration and from your own coherence. And you're a beautiful model for the rest of us to derive hope and meaning and lessons from. So thank you, John, and thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your love.
Yeah, thank you too, Katie. And keep up the great work. And to the listeners, be your most authentic self. The world needs you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for being here for this conversation. This is exactly why the Sincerely Show exists. To witness real human stories. Stories of individuals that have dedicated their life to service and contribution. Stories of people who have walked through darkness and heaviness and found their way back to themselves, to their deeper selves, towards a place that is more whole, and again, to a life of service and contribution. My hope is that something in what you just heard helped you feel less alone, more hopeful, and perhaps closer to meaning and purpose in your own life. This is a judgment-free space. If something moved you, inspired you, or sparked a reflection of your own, I would genuinely love to hear it. Share what this conversation opened in your heart. That is the kind of exchange that makes this community, the Sincerely community, what it is. It's what makes Sincerely, genuinely Sincerely. What I ask is that we hold each other with the same love and kindness that brought us here. This is a place of curiosity, not criticism, of witnessing, not judging. If you are sharing, share from your own experience and from a place of love and kindness. That is always enough. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with someone who you'd like to hear it. That is the most generous thing you can do, not just for the show, but for the people in your life who are quietly looking for this, looking to feel less alone, for hope, for meaning, for lessons. And before we close, this conversation is for reflection and perspective only. It should not be relied upon as therapy or professional advice. Please always seek qualified support where needed before making any decisions based on what you heard here today, or heard or observed at Sincerely overall. This content is also subject to our full terms and conditions, which you can find on our website at sincerelyinc.com. Thank you again for joining the Sincerely Show. Until next time, please take good care. Thank you so much.